Hey there, and welcome to this explainer video on how to use our Miro board to quickly draw your data flow diagrams, or DFDs. If you want an introduction on what a DFD is and when to use which symbol, you can click this link to our introductory video on data flow diagrams, and then you can come back to this one where I'm going to give you an example of how to use this template. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit to show you the library that we've made for you. So here in this view over here, you'll find all of the different elements as copyable objects. So you can copy any of these elements to the canvas below to start drawing your data flow diagram. And in Miro, there's a few different ways to copy something. You can select it and then press Control D or Command D on a Mac to just duplicate it and drag it along. That's one way to do it. You can also select it and use Control C, Control V, just like you do with text, or Command C, Command V on a Mac and drag it out. Or you can hold down the Control key while you're dragging something, or the Option key on a Mac to duplicate it like that. There are a few different ways to do that. You just pick whichever one makes you feel most comfortable. So now that we have an element on the canvas here, I'm going to pretend that I'm building a mobile medical application that allows a patient to enter data into a smartphone app. The smartphone app then connects to a cloud backend to make some calculations based on the patient data, and then it gives them back a result. So here we have an external entity, so we're going to call this the patient, and then we have this process over here we're going to call the mobile medical app. So now we have two entities here. Let's see how we can connect those entities with data flows. So as I already said, you will be a patient that is entering data into a mobile medical app. So if you select an element in Miro, you will see these blue dots appearing around it. And if you click that blue dot on the side where there's already something else, I'm just going to show you how that works. You just click it and it immediately connects these two elements together. So let's see if we can do that again. Apparently it doesn't work to make the connection back again as well. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use the second way to connect two elements together. I'm going to hover my mouse over the blue dot, but instead of clicking it, I'm going to click and hold down my mouse button, and then you'll see that I can choose where the arrowhead lands. So I can see that there's an attachment point here. It's kind of like snaps on like a magnet, and that's that. And now those two entities are connected to each other. So let's say that I want to start showing what kind of data moves from the patient to the app. So let's say that what I am entering here as a patient into the mobile medical app is, of course, medical data that I'm entering here. And for your specific application, it might be a heart rate or a blood pressure or your mood or anything else. But for now, we're going to keep it generic and just say medical data. And the patient will get something back from the application as well. So we also have, if you double click this arrow, you also have a medical conclusion coming back. So this is already something to get us started. And one more thing I'd like to show you is the way these arrows are drawn. Now you see that they kind of go in straight angles. When you select an arrow over here in Miro, you can go to a line type, and then you can have them drawn as straight lines or as more of a squiggly line with round objects that make sure that you get very wavy curves here, but that's maybe not the worst idea. Let's do it like this, and then I want this attachment point to be a little bit more here, and this one a little bit more here, and then it kind of looks okay. So now that we have this out of the way, I'm also going to take these labels and drag them out a little bit. So now you see that the text is next to the arrow and there's just one black dot appearing to show you where that label is attached to. I'm going to do the same for medical data over here. So in order for this app to benefit from a cloud API that we also have set up, we're also going to add that to the threat model, of course. We're going to duplicate this entity. I'm just going to hold down my control key, option key on a Mac, and duplicate that one out here. And I am then going to be calling this one backend API, for example. And then this medical data that the patient fed into the mobile medical app, there will maybe be some kind of a validation here before it gets forwarded. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to connect these two together and say that the medical data is now also forwarded to the API. And just like that, the API might still consult different services here on its backend, but let's maybe assume that this API is going to return, it's going to return this medical conclusion here as well. There. And then this endpoint, I'm also gonna drag that one in a little bit. So then we have this. So again, this API will probably have other things that it communicates with in the cloud, and it really depends on the scope of your threat model whether or not you want to go beyond doing that. Of course, there will be machine learning models that, based on a lot of medical data from a lot of patients, will be able to make better conclusions to better help the patient. How does that data get into that system? How was that machine learning algorithm trained? How does all of that work? All very interesting questions, but we're not going to include it in the scope of this threat model. We're just going to make this an easy one as an example, but of course you can expand out of there depending on the time you have and what your scope is. One thing we already want to point out is that this mobile medical app, so all of this lives in the comfort of the home of the patient. This backend API, however, lives on the internet. So what we do want to do is we're going to get a trust boundary in here. And we're going to, again, duplicate this one. And I'm going to just drag that open a little bit to show that this is an attack surface that we do want to examine. This connection goes over the internet. This arrow over here, the patient using the app, that's just the patient using an on-screen keyboard to enter data in here. And the medical conclusion is displayed on the screen. So these data flows over here all happen for the patient in their own hands, so to speak. This data then gets transferred over the internet to here. So this is a lot more of a risky transaction than this one is. So we're firstly going to have a look at this transaction with a trust boundary. All trust boundaries, of course, need a number. So I'm going to remove the X here and call this trust boundary 1. So another thing I'm wondering is, how does this backend API know who this patient is? How does this app authenticate against this backend API? So just with medical data, it would be a little bit odd to say that that is something that authenticates someone to an API. So it's not just the medical data that gets forwarded here. I know by talking to my friends in the mobile software development department that there is something that is also transferred across this trust boundary. And that piece of data is what we call an access token. Now, you don't need to worry about what that access token is or what it looks like, but it is something that we use to authenticate the mobile app against the backend API. So now the question arises, where did this access token come from? Because it looks like it just appeared from thin air here in the mobile medical app. That's of course not the case. What we also have in this whole story is some kind of an identity provision that happens to make sure that the patient is who they say they are. So what I'm going to do, to move this down a little bit, I'm going to add another external entity on the canvas. And this is a third-party identity provider, also sometimes referred to as an IDP. So the access token we have here comes from the identity provider. The identity provider gave it to the mobile medical app when the patient logged into there. So this is some data that is flowing that we haven't identified yet. Before we start drawing those data flows, I want to point your attention to the cheat sheet that we've made here with tips and tricks for drawing data flow diagrams. And as you can see here, it can sometimes be a little bit tedious to know when is something an external entity and when is it a process. So in doubt, I usually say start with an external entity, and then when you're asking questions about how does this get managed and how do we have access to it and what level of control do we as a service provider have over it, I then usually start moving to calling it a process. So in short, this could be an external entity, it could be a process. For now, I'm just going to leave it like this. And I'm going to say that this access token that we got here made its way into the mobile medical app. And the way that it got there is because my patient over here has been logging in to a web view in the mobile medical app through which the patient was able to enter a username and a password. So we have a username and a password here. That gets passed on to the third-party identity provider. The identity provider then does a check whether or not the username and the password check out. The identity provider then forwards an access token to the app. And of course, inside of the mobile medical app, there's a storage mechanism that stores this. But for the sake of simplicity, we're not going to draw a data store here. If you want to do that, if you want to observe the data that flows internally inside of your mobile application, you can do that if you want. You can definitely add a data store here and then have the whole mechanism of transferring that access token into the storage mechanism of your smartphone. You can do all of that. For this threat model, I'm just going to assume that the access token made its way into the mobile medical app and it is able to pass it on to the backend API. Depending on the authentication mechanism that was used, you can also maybe have a refresh token here. Let's assume that it's that kind of a flow. So there's a refresh token going here, and then the moment in time where this access token expires, the mobile medical app is going to go back to the identity provider and offer it its refresh token. There we go. And then upon providing that refresh token, it gets a new access token and a new refresh token back, and then it can provide it to the backend system. The connection between the mobile medical app and the third-party identity provider is also something that goes across the internet. So I definitely also want to have a trust boundary here. Let's draw it here on the screen and put that one over here. And we'll then call this trust boundary number 2. Now the question presents itself of whether or not to include this data flow in this trust boundary. So would I be extending this trust boundary to here? Is the level of trust between my patient and the third-party IDP a same trust change than it is between the app and the IDP? You could argue yes. You could also argue that interactions between external entities are not something that we need to concern ourselves with. And this is really where it comes down to, are you going to design this as a process or are you going to design this as an external entity? Again, if you're in doubt, and this would be a point in time where you could argue maybe turning the third-party IDP into a process, if our company as a publisher of this application is actually also responsible for managing the identities here. Let's say that this is a social sign-in. So we imagine that this application, its sign-in mechanism is one of those social sign-ins, like sign in with Google or sign in with LinkedIn or sign in with Facebook, in that case, it is completely separate from us. Then we can say, okay, this is an external entity, and we don't really have any business with how the username and password get transferred. If we manage this one, let's say that we have a tenant in Microsoft Entra ID or Auth0 or one of those identity providers where we do the management of the users, then I would turn it into a process. But in this case, I'm going to say that this is social sign in with Google, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and I am not going to necessarily worry about this data flow over here. It's a conversation that happens between two entities that are outside of my control, so I can't necessarily secure that. The only thing that I can secure is the URL that gets called when this mobile medical app wants to open this login page. But that is something that needs to happen in code here, that is done at the provisioning stage. That is not something that the patient has any influence over when they enter their data over here. So that's it for this video. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments, and I'll be seeing you next time. Bye-bye.